The Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly was built to make every visitor feel small. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and its walls were lined with the flags of 400 member worlds. Today, those flags hung still, because every delegate in the chamber was watching one seat. The human seat. For 300 years, humanity had sat in that chair. They had come late to the galaxy, climbing out of their solar system, long after other species had already built empires among the stars. The older races had looked down on them at first, calling them primitive, violent, and short-lived. But when the Kreth Empire tried to conquer half the galaxy, it was human fleets that broke their advance at the Battle of Vera Drift. When the plague ships of the Hollow Year threatened a dozen worlds, it was human doctors and human engineers who built the quarantine stations that saved them. Humanity had been useful. Humanity had been necessary, but necessary was not the same as respected. Over the decades, the old families of the galaxy grew uneasy. Humans bred quickly, they expanded quickly. Their ships, once crude, had become some of the most advanced in known space. Worse, humans refused to follow the old customs. They did not bow to the ancient noble houses. They questioned rulings instead of accepting them. They formed alliances based on trade and friendship instead of bloodline and tradition. To the old powers, humanity was no longer a useful tool. It was a threat. So today, the assembly had gathered to vote. Ambassador Elena Cho sat in the human chair, her hands folded calmly on the table in front of her. She was not young. Silver streaked through her dark hair, and lines marked her face from decades of service. But her eyes were steady, and she showed no fear as the Speaker of the Assembly rose to read the resolution. By a vote of 312 in favor, 51 against, the Speaker said, his voice echoing through the hall, "This Assembly declares the human species banished from all recognized galactic space. All human ships, colonies, and citizens are to withdraw beyond the outer rim within 1 standard year. Galactic gates will no longer recognize human transit codes. This is final." A murmur passed through the chamber. Many of the delegates had expected protest. They had expected the human ambassador to argue, to threaten, perhaps even to storm out in anger. Humans were known for their tempers, after all. Some species in the chamber leaned forward, eager to see the famous human anger on display. It never came. Elena Cho rose slowly from her seat. She looked around the hall, at faces she had known for years, some friendly, some cold, most simply careful. She had negotiated trade deals with the Dreven Council. She had shared meals with the Velt ambassador's family. She had stood beside half these delegates during the plague crisis, working through sleepless nights to save their people. "Thank you," she said, "for your clarity." The hall went quiet. It was not the response anyone expected. "My people have given the galaxy 300 years, Elena continued, her voice calm and even. "We fought your wars. We healed your sick. We opened trade routes that made half the fortunes in this room. We did this gladly, as friends do for friends. But friendship, it seems, was never the foundation of this assembly. Convenience was. And now that we have become inconvenient, you have made your choice clear." She paused, letting her words settle over the chamber. "We accept this assembly's decision. We will withdraw beyond the outer rim, as ordered, within the year. We will trouble you no further." With that, she turned and walked from the chamber, her aides following behind her. No threats, no anger, no appeal for mercy, just a quiet exit, the doors closing softly behind her. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Outside the assembly building, beneath a sky filled with 100 different starships from 100 different worlds, Elena's aide, a young man named Marcus Webb, finally spoke. "That's it? We just leave?" Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "That's it." Marcus shook his head, struggling to understand. "Ambassador, with respect, they just kicked us out of galactic civilization. Our colonies, our trade routes, everything we built here for 3 centuries. Don't you want to fight this?" "Fight how?" Elena asked, climbing into the transport waiting for them. "With words. In a room that has already decided not to listen? With weapons. Against 400 worlds who would unite against us the moment we raised a single gun. No, Marcus. There is a better way to answer this insult, which is..." Elena looked out the window as the transport lifted off, carrying them away from the great glass towers of the assembly core. Below them, The city sprawled in every direction, built from the architecture and technology of a dozen different species, including, though few of them remembered it, the gate technology that made interstellar travel between most of these worlds possible at all. "We give them exactly what they asked for," Elena said quietly. "We leave, all the way, completely." Marcus frowned. "I don't understand." "You will," Elena said. "Send the signal to Earth. Tell the Council it's time to begin Operation Quiet Door." Far across the galaxy, on the green and blue world that had once been humanity's only home, the message arrived within the hour. In a deep underground command center beneath the city of Geneva, lights flickered on across a wall of monitors. An older woman with cropped gray hair and tired eyes read the message twice before nodding to herself. "They voted to banish us," said the man beside her, a tall engineer named Dr. Adebayo Osei. "They did," the woman, Councilwoman Tanya Reyes, replied. "Then it's time." Reyes nodded slowly. "Activate the withdrawal plan. Every colony, every outpost, every gate node we control. I want it done quietly, and I want it done completely. No mistakes, no traces left behind." Osei allowed himself a small, grim smile. "They have no idea what they just did, do they?" "No," Reyes said, turning to look at the massive star chart that covered one wall of the command center, glowing with thousands of points of light, marking human-built infrastructure, scattered across a third of the galaxy. "They think they banished a tenant. They don't realize they just evicted the landlord." What the Assembly did not know, what only a handful of humans in positions of deep trust truly understood, was the scale of what humanity had quietly built over 3 centuries. While other species fought wars and guarded ancient bloodlines, humans had spent their time differently. They had engineered the deep architecture beneath galactic civilization itself. The relay stations, the gate stabilizers, the long-range communication arrays that kept the wider galaxy connected. It was unglamorous work. It earned no thrones, no titles, no seats of honor. But it was necessary work, and humans had always been good at doing necessary things quietly, without asking for credit. Now, the galaxy had told humanity it was no longer welcome, so humanity intended to take its work with it. Back in the Assembly Corps, the celebrations had already begun in some quarters. Delegates congratulated each other in the hallways, certain they had solved a growing problem before it became an unstoppable one. The Velt ambassador, an old reptilian diplomat named Saurik, allowed himself a rare smile as he walked past the closed doors of the now empty human delegation office. "One less headache," he murmured to an aide. He had no idea that 3 floors below the assembly building, in a maintenance corridor few delegates ever visited, a small human engineering team was already disconnecting the primary stabilizer relay that fed power to the Assembly Corps' own gate terminal, the very gate that connected this world to 100 others. It would be months before anyone noticed the slow, creeping failures beginning across the galaxy's transportation network. By then, it would be too late to ask humanity to come back and fix it. The doors of human space were closing, one quiet relay at a time, and no one in the Great Hall of the Assembly had any idea the door was even shutting until long after it had already sealed behind them. The first sign of trouble came not from a battlefield, but from a cargo manifest. On the trade world of Hest Prime, a merchant named Davu Kor stood in his shipping office, staring at a screen that refused to show what he needed to see. For 30 years, his company had moved grain and machine parts between 6 different star systems, using gate routes that had never once failed him. Today, the gate scheduling system showed nothing. No departures, no arrivals. Just a blinking error where the human-maintained relay station used to report its status. "Call the relay office," Davu told his assistant. "Tell them their system is broken." The assistant tried. No one answered. They tried again the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, word had spread through Hest Prime that the relay station, quietly run by a small human engineering crew for the last 40 years, had gone completely silent. Ships that needed to pass through its gate were stuck waiting in orbit, burning fuel they could not spare. It was a small story on a small world. No one in the Assembly Corps paid it much attention. But Hest Prime was not alone. Across a third of the galaxy, similar stories were unfolding. Relay stations going dark, gate stabilizers reporting errors no engineer could explain. Communication arrays that had functioned perfectly for decades suddenly losing connection to their human maintenance crews. At first, each incident seemed isolated, an unfortunate coincidence, a string of bad luck. Councilwoman Tanya Reyes watched the pattern emerge from a secure terminal, deep beneath Geneva, a small, satisfied nod, the only sign of her feelings. Beside her, Dr. Osei tracked the same data on a second screen, a long list of facility names slowly turning from green to gray. Sector by sector, just as planned, Osei said. No panic yet. They still think it's equipment failure. It won't stay that way for long, Reyes replied. Keep the teams moving. I want every non-essential worker home within 60 days. Across human-controlled space, that order set a quiet machine into motion. On worlds humans had settled, on stations humans had built, on outposts that existed at the edges of explored space, packing began. It was not the desperate, chaotic packing of refugees fleeing danger. It was calm, organized, almost rehearsed. Because in truth, it had been rehearsed, for years, in secret drills that most ordinary humans had assumed were simple emergency preparedness exercises. On the mining colony of New Helena, deep in territory shared uneasily with the insectoid Schiff Collective, a young woman named Priya Anand helped her family load the last of their belongings onto a transport ship. She had been born on New Helena. It was the only home she had ever known, with its red dust plains and twin moons rising each night over the processing towers her grandfather had helped build. I don't understand why we have to leave so fast, she said to her mother, watching workers dismantle solar arrays that had powered the colony for 2 generations. Because the assembly told us to leave, her mother said simply, not looking up from her work. And because we are not the kind of people who leave a mess behind for others to deal with. It was not quite the whole truth, but it was enough for a 16-year-old to accept. Not every farewell was so calm. On the trade station Farron's Reach, an old Schiff merchant named Tickrick approached the human dock supervisor with desperate offers, triple payment, exclusive contracts, anything to convince the small human logistics team to stay just a little longer and keep the station's failing systems running. You cannot simply leave, Tickrick clicked, his mandibles working anxiously. 40,000 of my people depend on the systems your people built, the cooling arrays, the water reclamation. Your engineers designed all of it. No one else understands it well enough to maintain it. The dock supervisor, a tired man named Frank Delgado, who had spent 15 years on Farron's Reach and considered Tickrick something close to a friend, found he had no good answer to give. He had not built the policy. He only had to follow it. I'm sorry, Frank said, and he meant it. We were told to withdraw, and we were told why. I don't have the authority to stay, even if I wanted to. Then who does? Tickrick demanded. Frank did not know. Above his pay grade were people he had never met, following plans he did not fully understand, all converging toward a single, coordinated deadline. He helped load the last shuttle himself, watching Tickrick's anxious eyes follow him all the way to the airlock. Not every human agreed with the withdrawal either. In a quiet bar on the edge of the assembly core itself, a retired human fleet officer named Captain James Holt argued late into the night with 2 old comrades, both human engineers, who had spent their careers maintaining gate infrastructure. You're really going to do this? Holt demanded, his voice rough with old scars and old anger. Just shut it all down and walk away, after everything we built? We were ordered to leave, one of the engineers said quietly. We're leaving. All of it goes with us. That's not leaving. That's sabotage, Holt snapped. There are children on some of these stations who will freeze or starve when the systems fail. Innocent people who never voted to banish us. The engineer's expression did not change, though something tired passed behind his eyes. Every facility gets a full shutdown notice and an evacuation window before we leave. No one will die from surprise. What happens after they have time to prepare is not our responsibility anymore. The assembly made that very clear. Holt slammed his glass down on the table. And you're fine with that? Just following orders, just like that? No, the engineer said. I'm not fine with any of it, but I'm not going to spend my last year in this galaxy fighting my own people over a decision that was already made by people far above both of us. Go home, James. Pack your things. The ship leaves in 3 weeks, with or without you. Holt did not answer. He sat alone in the bar long after his friends had gone, staring into an empty glass, trying to decide if loyalty to the people who raised him was worth more than loyalty to the strangers who had just thrown them away. In the end, he packed his things. Word of the withdrawal eventually reached the assembly corps, though by the time it did, it had already spread too far to stop quietly. A junior aide brought the first full report to Speaker Van Ostrith's office, a thick file full of relay outages and colony evacuations spreading across dozens of systems. "This is more than coincidence," the aide said. "The humans are pulling out completely, not just from the rim colonies the resolution named, everywhere." Speaker Ostrith frowned, flipping through the file. The resolution only required withdrawal beyond the outer rim. It said nothing about abandoning infrastructure within assembly space. "No, sir. But it appears the humans are taking the position that anything they built, anything they maintain, belongs to them to take or leave as they choose." Ostrith set the file down slowly. For the first time since the vote, a small flicker of unease crossed his face. "Get me a full inventory. I want to know exactly how much of our gate network the humans actually control." The answer, when it came 2 days later, was not the answer he wanted. It was not entire fleets the humans were taking with them. It was not weapons or warships or armies. Those, the assembly could have managed, could have replaced, could have prepared for. What the humans were taking was smaller, and far more dangerous to lose. The patient, careful, decades-long expertise embedded in every relay station, every stabilizer core, every piece of unglamorous infrastructure that no one else had ever bothered to learn how to maintain. The assembly had banished a species it believed was, at most, a powerful and occasionally troublesome ally. It was only beginning to understand it had banished its own foundation. The order came down from Geneva, exactly 11 months after the assembly's vote, on a gray morning, that Dr. Adebayo Osei would remember for the rest of his life. "Begin final sequence," Councilwoman Reyes said, standing before the command center's massive star chart. The thousands of glowing points that had once marked human-controlled relay stations, gate stabilizers, and communication arrays had been shrinking steadily for months, turning from green to gray as each facility completed its shutdown and evacuation. Now only a few hundred remained lit, the largest and most critical nodes, saved for last because they were the hardest to walk away from cleanly. "All non-essential personnel are already clear," Osei confirmed, checking the data scrolling past him. "Final engineering crews are in position at every major node. They're ready when you give the word." Reyes looked at the chart for a long moment. 300 years of work, 3 centuries of quiet engineering that had connected a third of the galaxy had run through human hands. It was strange, she thought, how something built with such care could be dismantled with a single order. "Give the word," she said. Across the galaxy, in places few delegates of the assembly had ever bothered to visit, small teams of human engineers began the final sequence. At the Hest Prime relay station, the last human technician, a quiet woman named Soo-Jin Park, walked through the empty control room one final time. The station had been fully evacuated for weeks, its corridors silent except for the hum of machinery that had run without interruption for 40 years. She placed her palm against the main control panel, watched the system run through its final diagnostic check, and then entered the shutdown command. The lights along the control panel dimmed one by one. Outside the station's main window, the shimmering gate that had connected Hest Prime to 6 other systems flickered, dimmed, and went dark for the first time in 4 decades. Soo-Jin did not linger. She boarded the small shuttle waiting in the station's only remaining open bay, and within the hour, the relay station was empty, its systems sealed, its doors locked from the inside in a way that would take any outside engineering team months to even understand, let alone undo. The same scene repeated itself, with small variations, at hundreds of locations across the galaxy. Stabilizer cores were powered down and physically sealed. Communication arrays were stripped of their critical components and shut into permanent standby. Gate terminals, the great shimmering rings that had allowed instant travel between star systems for over a century, simply stopped working, their human-built guidance systems gone dark and unresponsive. It was not destruction. Nothing was blown up. Nothing was burned. No violence marked the withdrawal at all. It was something quieter and, in its way, more total. A complete and careful removal of everything humanity had ever built. Undone, with the same patience it had taken to build it in the first place. On Farron's Reach, Frank Delgado watched from the deck of the last human transport ship as the station's gate terminal flickered and died behind him. Tickrick stood on the station's observation platform, his mandibles still, watching the same sight. Frank had said his goodbyes the week before. There was nothing left to say now, only the silent, mutual understanding of two old friends on opposite sides of a decision neither of them had made. The human transport pulled away, joining a long, quiet line of ships converging toward the outer rim from every direction, carrying the last of humanity's people, equipment, and expertise away from a galaxy that had told them, in no uncertain terms, that they were no longer welcome. It took nearly 3 weeks for the first major failures to reach the assembly core itself. It began with delays. Trade ships scheduled to arrive through long-established gate routes simply did not appear. Communication relays that connected distant assembly outposts to the core began dropping signals, then losing connection entirely. Within the assembly's own administrative network, reports that should have taken minutes to transmit across the galaxy began taking days, then weeks, routed through slower, older systems that most species had forgotten still existed. Speaker Ostrith called an emergency session within the month, the Great Hall filled not with the confident murmur of celebration that had marked the banishment vote, but with anxious, urgent conversation. "I want a full report," Ostrith said, "on the status of the gate network." The report, delivered by a nervous senior engineer from the Assembly's own infrastructure division, was not reassuring. Approximately 60% of all gate routes connecting Assembly member worlds have failed or are operating at severely reduced capacity, the engineer said, his voice unsteady. The failures are concentrated in nodes previously maintained by human engineering teams. Our own technical staff have attempted to access the affected facilities, but what? Ostrith demanded. "The systems have been sealed, sir. Not damaged. Sealed. Deliberately. And very thoroughly. Our best engineers estimate it would take years, possibly decades, to fully understand and replicate the technology well enough to bring these systems back online ourselves." A wave of disbelief rippled through the chamber. The Velt ambassador, Sautrick, who had once smiled at the thought of one less headache, rose from his seat with visible alarm. "This is unacceptable," he said. 60% of trade routes failed, means famine on a dozen worlds within the year. It means stranded fleets, broken supply lines, economic collapse across half the galaxy. Someone must contact the humans immediately and demand they return to repair what they have broken. "They have broken nothing," came a quiet voice from the back of the chamber. It belonged to an aging Dreven trade delegate named Hask Mirren, one of the few who had voted against the banishment resolution 11 months earlier. "They built it. They maintained it for 300 years, asking little in return beyond basic respect. We ordered them to leave, and they have done exactly that, taking only what was always theirs to take. There is no law in this assembly, written or unwritten, that says a builder must leave their work behind for those who exiled them." The chamber fell into uneasy silence. "Then what do you suggest we do?" Ostrith asked. "I suggest," Hask said slowly, "that we should have thought of this before the vote, not after." In the weeks that followed, the Assembly sent formal diplomatic requests toward human space, addressed to the Council on Earth, asking, though carefully avoiding the word begging, for technical assistance in restoring critical infrastructure. Reyes received the first of these requests in the Geneva Command Center, reading it twice before passing it to Osei without comment. "They want us to come back and fix it," Osei said. "Of course they do," Reyes replied. "What's our answer?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment, thinking of 300 years of service rendered and 300 years of quiet condescension received in return, of a vote that had taken less than an hour to strip away 3 centuries of partnership. "Our answer," she said finally, "is the same one we gave at the vote. We have already left. There is nothing further to discuss." The message sent back to the Assembly was brief, polite, and absolutely final. It thanked the Assembly for its continued correspondence, noted that humanity remained fully compliant with the terms of its banishment, and confirmed that no further human personnel, equipment, or expertise would be made available to galactic space under any circumstances. It was signed, simply, by the Council of Earth, far beyond the outer rim, in systems no assembly mapmaker had ever bothered to chart in detail. The last of humanity's ships completed their long journey home. Behind them, the gates fell silent one by one. the great shimmering rings going dark across a third of the galaxy, leaving behind only the slow, creeping realization among 100 species that they had not banished a tenant after all. They had evicted the only people who had ever known how to keep the lights on. 2 years after the gates fell silent, the galaxy that the Assembly had once ruled with confidence looked very little like the one that had voted to banish humanity. The great trade routes that had connected 400 worlds for over a century now existed only in fragments, isolated pockets of working gates, separated by vast stretches of dead, sealed terminals. Species that had once traveled between star systems in hours now faced journeys of months or years, using slower conventional engines, the kind most younger generations had never needed to learn how to build or fly, on worlds that had depended on regular trade shipments for food, medicine, and basic manufacturing. The consequences arrived slowly, then all at once. The mining colonies of the Shift Collective, cut off from the agricultural worlds that had fed them for generations, faced their first true famine in living memory. Tikrik, the old merchant from Farron's Reach, found himself organizing desperate supply convoys, using ships that took 6 months to make journeys that Gates had once completed in a single afternoon. Old rivalries, long suppressed by the careful diplomatic balance human fleets had helped maintain, began to resurface. Without the threat of human military intervention to discourage conflict, border disputes that had simmered quietly for decades flared into open skirmishes. The Kreth Empire, defeated but never fully dismantled after its war against humanity a generation earlier, began testing the borders of its smaller neighbors again, probing for weakness now that the old peacekeepers were gone. Speaker Ostrith, 3 years into a position that had once promised him a quiet, comfortable legacy, found himself instead presiding over an assembly in crisis. The great hall that had once buzzed with confident ambition now echoed with arguments, accusations, and increasingly desperate proposals. "We must send a formal delegation," argued the Velt ambassador, Sarek, his earlier satisfaction long since replaced by visible strain. "Not messages. Not requests transmitted through dead relay systems. A physical delegation, traveling by conventional ship if necessary, to stand before the Council of Earth and negotiate humanity's return." "And offer them what?" asked Hask Mirren, the old Dreven delegate who had voted against the banishment from the beginning. "An apology? A reversal of the vote? Do you imagine they will simply forgive 300 years of condescension because we have finally noticed the cost of losing them? I imagine," Sestimric snapped, "that they are still, beneath everything, a practical species. Practical people negotiate. Practical people find solutions that serve both sides. Practical people also remember being told they were no longer welcome," Hask replied evenly. "And practical people do not always forgive, simply because circumstances have changed for those who wronged them." The argument raged on for hours, as it had many times before, but in the end, desperation won out over pride. The Assembly authorized a formal delegation, the first official contact attempt toward human space since the withdrawal had been completed. The journey itself took the better part of a year. The delegation's ship, a converted diplomatic vessel retrofitted with older conventional engines, traveled the long way around dead gate networks and through neutral territory, carrying a dozen representatives from across the Assembly's remaining member worlds. Shauric led the delegation himself, accompanied reluctantly by Hask Mirren, whose presence the Assembly Council had insisted upon, believing his earlier opposition to the banishment might earn the delegation some goodwill among the humans. They did not know, of course, that human attitudes toward the Assembly had moved past goodwill and grievance alike into something closer to quiet indifference. As the delegation's ship crossed into what had once been the outer edge of human-controlled space, the crew began to notice the changes. Old colony markers, once bright with active beacon signals, now sat dark and silent, their systems either removed entirely or left in careful, deliberate standby. Navigation charts that had guided travelers through this region for decades were no longer accurate, with entire systems missing data, redirected, or simply blank. "They didn't just leave," one of the delegation's younger officers observed, studying the sensor readings with growing unease. "They erased themselves. There's nothing here. No beacons, no relay stations, no trace they were ever present at all." Sodric said nothing, watching the empty starfield pass by the viewport, the weight of what they had done finally beginning to settle on him in a way that abstract reports and committee meetings never had. Eventually, the delegation's ship reached the edge of the outer rim itself, the boundary line the Assembly's own resolution had drawn 3 years earlier, marking the limit beyond which humanity had been ordered to retreat. Here, finally, the empty silence broke. A single automated buoy floated in the void, broadcasting a simple, repeating signal in a dozen galactic languages. "This marks the boundary of human territory," the message read. "Unauthorized vessels are requested to turn back. Diplomatic inquiries may be submitted through standard channels. Response times may be significant." "That's it?" Shalrik asked, staring at the message displayed on the bridge screen. "After everything, that's all they have to say to us?" "What did you expect?" Hask asked quietly. "An apology? A welcome party?" Shalrik did not answer. The delegation's communications officer attempted contact through the channels the buoy had specified, transmitting a formal request for an in-person diplomatic meeting with representatives of the Council of Earth. The response, when it finally arrived 11 days later, was brief, courteous, and utterly without warmth. It informed the delegation that the Council of Earth had reviewed their request and determined that, given the unresolved status of the Assembly's banishment resolution, an in-person diplomatic meeting was not appropriate at this time. It thanked the delegation for their interest and wished them a safe journey home. There was no invitation to continue the conversation, no indication of when, or if, such a meeting might become appropriate in the future. Just a closed door, polite and final, mirroring the same calm, unshakable composure Elena Cho had shown in the assembly hall 3 years earlier. Shalrik read the message 3 times before finally setting it down, something like genuine grief crossing his reptilian features for the first time in his long political career. "We are not going to be allowed back, are we?" he asked. "Not soon," Hask said. "Perhaps not ever. We had 300 years to learn what they were worth, Shalrik, and we spent that time deciding they were beneath us instead. I do not think a single delegation, sent only after the cost became unbearable, will undo that in a matter of months." The delegation's ship turned back toward assembly space empty-handed, carrying nothing but confirmation of what most of the galaxy had already begun to suspect. That the door humanity had sealed behind them was not the kind that would simply reopen, because those who closed it were finally, belatedly, asking nicely. Behind them, beyond the silent boundary marker, human space remained dark, quiet, and utterly indifferent to the galaxy that had once called it useful, then called it dangerous, then finally, when it was already too late, called it mist. 10 years passed before the galaxy beyond the outer rim sent another delegation, and this time, it was not the assembly that sent it. By then, the great assembly that had once governed 400 worlds with confident authority had fractured into smaller regional councils, each struggling to manage what remained of its territory without the gate network that had once bound everything together. The Kreth Empire had expanded twice into neighboring systems, fought to a standstill only by costly conventional wars that human fleets would once have prevented before they began. The Chif Collective had survived its famine years, but only by abandoning a third of its mining colonies and rebuilding its economy around slower, self-sufficient methods that bore little resemblance to the trade-dependent prosperity it had once enjoyed. Speaker Ostrith had long since retired, replaced by a younger administrator who had grown up hearing stories of the old galaxy, the one with instant gates and easy travel, as something closer to legend than memory. Hask Mirren had passed away peacefully 5 years earlier, having spent his final years writing extensively about the banishment vote, arguing that it stood as the single greatest act of self-harm in the Assembly's long history. Few had listened while he lived. More listened after he was gone. It was a coalition of smaller, independent worlds, not the weakened Central Assembly, that finally organized the second delegation. These were worlds that had never voted for the banishment in the first place, places too small or too distant to have held much influence in the original assembly hall, but who had suffered the same consequences regardless. Their delegation was modest, a single ship, a handful of representatives, and no formal authority to negotiate on behalf of anyone but themselves. Among them was Priya Anand, no longer the 16-year-old girl who had once watched her family dismantle their home on New Helena. She was 30 now, and after years of her own colony's struggle to survive the gate network's collapse, she had volunteered for the journey, driven by a question that had followed her for a decade. What had become of the place she had once called home? The journey took the better part of a year, traveling slower routes through territory that had grown unfamiliar and unstable in the decades since the withdrawal. When their ship finally crossed the boundary into what had once been human space, the crew expected to find what the first delegation had found years earlier: silence, emptiness, a galaxy erased. What they found instead was something else entirely. The outer rim, once a quiet boundary line marking the edge of charted space, now hummed with activity. New gate terminals, built on technology far more advanced than anything the old galaxy had ever possessed, connected dozens of star systems in a tight, efficient network of human worlds. Ships moved between them constantly, sleek and unfamiliar in design, nothing like the vessels humanity had once flown within assembly space. "This isn't possible," murmured the delegation's pilot, studying the sensor readings with open astonishment. 10 years? They've built all of this in 10 years? Priya said nothing, staring out at a starfield filled with lights that had no business existing yet, somehow, did. The delegation's ship was intercepted within hours by a small human patrol vessel, its crew polite but firm as they requested identification and purpose of visit. When Priya explained who they were and why they had come, the patrol officer's expression softened slightly, though her professionalism never wavered. "I'll need to clear this with the council," the officer said. "Please hold position. Someone will be in contact shortly." The wait lasted only a few hours, far shorter than the 11 days the first delegation had endured a decade earlier. When the response finally came, it was not a rejection, but an invitation, carefully worded and cautiously extended. A single shuttle, carrying no more than 3 representatives, would be permitted to dock at a designated station for a limited, supervised visit. Priya was one of the 3 chosen. The station she arrived at defied everything she remembered of human engineering from her childhood. Where New Helena's processing towers had been practical, utilitarian structures built for function over form, this station combined both in ways she had never imagined. Vast open spaces filled with greenery, sunlight simulated so convincingly she nearly forgot she was aboard a station at all, rather than standing on a planet's surface. She was met by a woman who introduced herself simply as Director Osei, the daughter, Priya would later learn, of the same Dr. Adebayo Osei, who had helped oversee the original withdrawal a decade before. "You're the first outside delegation we've allowed this close in 10 years, Director Osei said, leading Priya and her companions through a quiet garden corridor. "I hope you understand how unusual this is." "I do," Priya said. "I think most of us assumed we'd find nothing out here. Ruins, maybe, or nothing at all." Osei smiled slightly. "Most people assumed the same thing about us, once, that we couldn't survive without the galaxy's approval. That banishment would be the end of us, not the beginning of something new." "It clearly wasn't the end," Priya said, looking out at the garden's sweeping, sunlit ceiling. "What happened out here? We stopped spending our energy trying to convince people who had already decided what we were worth," Osei said simply. "And we started building for ourselves, without needing anyone else's permission to do it." They walked in silence for a while, before Priya finally asked the question she had carried across a year of travel and a decade of uncertainty. "Will you ever come back to the rest of the galaxy, I mean? Reopen the gates, rejoin the assembly?" Osei considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know. That's the truth. There are people here who believe we owe the galaxy nothing further, not after 300 years of service repaid with a single vote. There are others who believe isolation forever is its own kind of mistake, that no people, however capable, should close themselves off from the wider universe completely. The debate isn't settled. It may not be settled for a long time yet." "And what do you believe?" Priya asked. Osei was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same wide, simulated sky that arched gently overhead. "I believe the galaxy spent 300 years deciding we were useful, but not worthy of respect. I believe that lesson cost them everything they built on our work, and it cost us nothing we couldn't rebuild better, on our own terms. I believe, if we ever do reopen those doors, it will not be because the galaxy asked nicely enough, or suffered long enough. It will be because we decide, freely, that the relationship is finally worth rebuilding on equal footing, not before." Priya nodded slowly, understanding settling over her in a way that felt both sad and strangely hopeful at once. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "not everyone out there wanted the vote that banished you. Some of us argued against it. Some of us have spent 10 years wishing it had never happened." "I know," Osei said gently. "We never forgot the ones who tried to help us, even at the end. That memory matters more than you might think." The delegation's visit lasted only 3 days before they were escorted back to the boundary and sent on their long journey home, carrying no formal treaty, no promise of renewed gates or restored trade, only a quiet, careful message for the worlds that had sent them. Humanity had not vanished, had not been crushed by its banishment, and had not been waiting desperately at the edge of the galaxy for permission to matter again. It had simply built something new, far from the people who once decided it was disposable, and it would decide, in its own time and on its own terms, whether the rest of the galaxy was ever worth letting back in. Years later, historians across what remained of the old assembly worlds would debate endlessly what the banishment vote had truly cost the galaxy. Some called it the single greatest strategic blunder in galactic history. Others argued it had simply revealed a truth that had always been there, hidden beneath centuries of convenient partnership, that humanity had never truly needed the galaxy's permission to thrive, only its respect, freely given, and just as easily withdrawn. The gates that had once connected 400 worlds remained silent, sealed exactly as humanity had left them a decade before, and far beyond the outer rim, in a galaxy of its own quiet making, humanity continued building, patient and unhurried, answering to no one but itself, exactly as it had chosen to do since the day the old galaxy decided it no longer wanted them at all.